Hello, everybody. You're all very, very welcome. In 1785, a French surgeon called Jean-Joseph Sue received a letter and 250 guineas from an Englishman. And in the letter, it said, "You have made me the happiest of all men by taking away from me a limb, which put an invincible obstacle to my happiness." And what had happened was apotemnophilia. I'm sure Malcolm and Mia will correct me in my pronunciation later. And what it is this was the first known case in the medical literature. It was from 1785. And the French surgeon Jean-Joseph Sue had initially refused the Englishman who had sought amputation of his limb, often the left limb, and it was the left limb in this case. And when the surgeon refused the Englishman produced a gun. And under threat of death, the surgeon agreed to remove the limb. Initially, it was for 100 guineas, but he ended up getting 250 guineas because a remarkable kind of aspect of this extraordinary condition is that very often the subjects of the amputation are actually quite happy about it. And the next 90 minutes, I think, are going to be a fascinating parallel between apotemnophilia and autogynephilia, between gender identity disorder and body integrity identity disorder, and between this idea that if the patient wants it, the patient should get it. And how far do we go? How far do medical ethics go that we protect people from wanting self-destruction, or do we allow people to self-destruct? So I'm going to introduce you, first of all, to the lovely Dr. Carrie Mendoza, the director of Genspect USA. Then to Mia Hughes, writer of the WPATH Files report and also director of Genspect Canada. We're delighted. And the newbie, Malcolm Clark, who brought apotemnophilia to the masses in, I think, 2000, or certainly a long time ago.
2000,
You first became interested. So maybe we'll begin with, maybe Mia, you could give a background to what you discovered, and then we'll move over to Malcolm's extraordinary experiences when he did the documentary for Horizon. So first of all, could you tell us what you kind of discovered when you studied this condition that has so many parallels when you just studied it for the WPATH Files?
Okay, so in the WPATH Files report, there were 4 case studies. So I've talked about them before, but I took a part. I view today's scandal, gender medicine, gender affirming care, as being something of like a super scandal that combines, well, at least 4 medical scandals of the past into one. And actually, if I had my way, I'd have added multiple personality disorder to make it 5. So one of them, I did the lobotomies, ovariotomy that we talked about last week. We have yet to talk about the hormone therapy, where pediatric endocrinologists tried to manipulate the height using hormones to make overly tall children average height and overly short children taller. But then apotemnophilia, which I don't know, Malcolm, if you actually know how to pronounce it correctly. That's how I pronounce it, and I'm going with that.
Yeah, apotemnophilia.
Yeah, which means love of amputees, right? Love of amputees or amputation? Amputation, I think.
I think it was love of amputation. It comes from the Greek apotemnia, which I think is to cut, and then obviously philia gets thrown in, and it was John Money who first gave it that sort of designation as a sort of love of amputation.
It is, because I've just remembered there is the love of amputees, which is acrotomnophilia, is it? Yes. Or something like that?
That's never caught on the same way, because the funny thing is apotemnophilia really is both, but it's the sort of respectable face of it. They try to make it respectable. It's the non-fetish one. It's just my identity one, but actually covers both, which is why that other word is never actually caught on.
And my understanding was acrotomophilia was being turned on by people who are amputated.
Being attracted to amputees, exactly. You see, and isn't that perfect? I'm going way ahead of myself here, but That's a good parallel with autogynephilia, because they're heterosexual men who are attracted to women, and then they're also attracted to themselves as women, whereas the acrotemnophiliac people are attracted to amputees and attracted to themselves as in the thought of being an amputee, and they'll go to great lengths to make that happen. So anyway, I drew that one in because I had written the Twitter thread, which I can go through in a minute. But I was taking the part of the medical scandal that I chose to compare to apotemnophilia wasn't actually autogynephilia, just because I didn't really go that deep into autogynephilia in the report. And so I compared it to the non-binary surgeries, because someone in the files says we're creating body types that don't exist in nature. And then I had been reading, there's a wonderful New York Times article, you probably know it, Malcolm, 2005. The headline is totally escaping me. It's exactly about apotemnophiliac people and wanting their legs cut off. And there's a quote in there by one of the leading researchers at the time, Dr. First, and he says, there are strong parallels with sex reassignment surgery, because, people want healthy body parts chopped off and they obsess over it. But it's actually, he says, it's not a very good parallel, because male and female are normal states, and you're trying to turn a male into a female, another normal type of body. It's not going to work, obviously. An inverted penis is not a vagina, but it was he pointed out that it was at least an attempt to bring about a normal human state. Whereas people who want leg amputations, or they want an arm cut off, or both the legs, you're creating, exactly like what they were talking about in the WPATH files, a body type that does not exist in nature. So I compared apotemnophilia to these absolutely ghoulish Frankenstein surgeries where, they'll nullify the body, or they'll create a second set of genitals, or I think I even slipped eunuch in there, because the eunuch people, there's two, there's Thomas Johnson and Michael Erwig who wrote, I think there are only two authors of the eunuch chapter in WPATH Standards of Care 8. And they borrow language from this apotemnophile community online, which is the wannabes. Like they'll talk about wannabe eunuchs, like men who want to be castrated, want to self-castrate because they want to be eunuchs. It seemed like a better parallel, even though we'll go into the similarities with autogynephilia. It is probably the strongest parallel is with autogynephilia.
And could you go back to the beginning and just talk about at first, Mia, just where did it begin? I know it was a kind of very similar to kind of transgenderism, very unknown in the medical literature. The odd person became obsessed with wanting to amputate their limbs. Some of them shot their legs off. Some of them took chainsaws to their legs. Some of them did extraordinary things. They even would like cut off their finger and then smash their finger so it wouldn't get reattached, because they were so determined to make sure that they would. And it was a psychiatric condition, as far as I can see, and still is.
Oh, sure. I mean, sure it is. I think the paraphilic aspect of it cannot be. We have to focus on the paraphilic aspect of it. So I think it's almost entirely an erotic desire, an erotic fixation. And so, it was very obscure and still is somewhat obscure, but becoming a little bit more popular, sadly. So John Money, of course, like there's so many links. You can link transsexualism or gender or whatever to this crazy amputee scandal. And of course, John Money was the one who started it. And I'm basically here to hear Malcolm speak anyway, but Malcolm, you actually interviewed the man who kicked it all off with John Money. Am I right? Greg Firth?
Well, I took part in I was asked to make a film. I was asked to help make a film. So there was a director, I think her name's Nikki Stockley, who made Complete Obsession, and she's a great director. She did 90, well, in fact, she did 100% of what was ever shown, because the guy I interviewed, the German guy who wanted his leg chopped off, in the end, always refused to sign the release form. And so we kept filming, and my producer kept saying, you have to get this, because once they signed the release form, it's very hard to wriggle out. He never did. But of course, he was such a great character, we kept filming. And then the scandal blew up. He already had his leg taken off, and he said, yeah, I will sign, I will sign. He had his leg taken off, and then he said, no, I'm not going to sign. And it's it's now become so scandalous, it was in the headlines of the Daily Mail and everything, that I'm not going to allow you to use my interview. So my interview ended up on the cutting room floor. But what I learned from filming with Hans sort of changed my whole attitude towards surgery in general, definitely transsexuality. And the reason transsexuality comes in is, as you suggest, the film itself has an interview with Russell Reed, who was the expert in transsexualism, as it was then called, in the 90s, and even advised the Labour government when they were drawing up the Gender Recognition Act, the first one in 2004. So he was on the expert panel, and he gave loads of advice to them. And it was him who, he was one of the two psychiatrists that the director was following, and the two psychiatrists who were giving the sign-off for the surgeon to allow these guys to have their legs chopped off. And he gave the go-ahead to Hans. He and the other guy didn't give the go-ahead to the woman, Corinne, who's in the film, because she wanted both legs removed. And there's a wonderful line from the other psychiatrist who said, yes, I mean, we can get our heads around the idea of chopping one leg off, but chopping two legs off seems excessive.
Right. I remember that you see, that sticks in my mind. Going back, well, okay, I'll go back to how I got obsessed with all of this.
Yeah.
So gender medicine, I figure out what's going on in gender clinics, happening to adolescents. None of it makes any sense. It's all totally baffling. And so I turn to history. I start reading about medical scandals. And I read Carl Elliott's amazing article in The Atlantic that was published in the year 2000, A New Way to Be Mad. And if you haven't read it, if anyone watching hasn't read it, I highly recommend it. It's absolutely brilliant. It's where I first came across the philosopher Ian Hacking, his concept of the transient mental illness and semantic contagion, how an idea, if you name and describe a condition, you create the means by which that condition spreads. And the whole article is about these apotemnophilia. It's about people who want their legs chopped off. And he talks about Malcolm's documentary. He talks about Complete Obsession. So from Carl Elliott's wonderful article, then I watched Complete Obsession, and this woman sticks in my mind, and precisely that part. So she's very, very specific that she wants both of her legs cut off at a very specific point. She knows exactly where both her legs are supposed to end. Remarkably, I mean, I don't know, she lives not on the ground floor. She lives like up a flight of steps. So she's, they film her walking up like this flight of steps. There's no elevator, and then going into her house. And she does like weekends where she's cheating. Well, no, she's not cheating. No cheat weekends where she has to pretend to be a double amputee the whole weekend, but carries the wheelchair up the steps. But then they deny her because she wants both her legs chopped off. The part that she throws me a little bit, because everything I've read, or almost everything I've read from the older literature, does suggest that this is a paraphilia. and erotically motivated. And we know that most paraphilias affect men. It's very rare to see a paraphilia in a woman, and yet she is the star of this document. She's one of the stars of the documentary, and very, very fixated on the desire to have both of her legs chopped off. So what do you make of that, Malcolm? Do you think she discredits the paraphilia, or do you think it exists in women too?
No, I think what's become apparent from gender affirming healthcare, as we're supposed to call it, is that there's a lot of women who are paraphilic, and that explains now a lot of the trans man phenomenon.
You think?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I'm trying to remember her name, it'll come back to me, but she wrote a book that sort of introduced the world to non-binary. It'll come back. I've written about her a couple of times, but she's a young, attractive woman who decided that she was kind of unsure about her body, and she got involved in the trans world, and she did a fantastic interview with this really dull guy on Google Interviews or something. And she explains, she said, I came about it backwards. I was interested in the surgery, and then I discovered trans. And so she has had her breasts removed. She doesn't do anything else, no hormones or anything, and she calls herself non-binary. And I think there's I think you're right that male paraphilia is like male sexuality, like boom, and they obsess and they go further, and it needs more and more and more and more. I do think though that a lot of the breast removal, phalloplasty stuff is. Remember that crazy, well, I'd say this crazy woman who was in the front page of the New York magazine, where she said, when I heard I was going to be able to get the biggest penis I could, I was so excited. I mean, yeah, that's medical, but that her in particular is a good example of how it was so paraphilic. I mean, didn't she recreate her own rape and stuff like that? And she did all. Was that?
He was very, very disturbed.
It was very disturbing. I mean, she paid a guy to reenact her rape, and then she gets this I mean, it's all extremely strange.
When we look into the world of amputating your limbs, you are in the extremities of life. These are people who are doing extraordinary things. We've put in a few articles for anybody who wants to kind of copy them and read them later on. And don't forget, we will be taking questions later on. The first article we put in was the one that Mia mentioned, which is At War with Their Bodies, They Seek to Sever Their Limbs, 2005. Yes. Then A New Way to Be Mad by Carl Elliott, which is The Atlantic, great article. And then, which I'm kind of very interested in, and maybe you two can speak about it, the John Money article with Greg Firth. And this is 1977, and arguably where it revitalizes as an idea. Like I said, it began in 1785. You will always get very unusual, I'm sure you'll speak to this, Carrie, very unusual freak cases of everything, if you follow me, everything. But Apotemnophilia, 1977, 2 cases of self-demand amputation as a paraphilia, and John Money and Greg Firth and another guy called Russell Jobans, I don't know that person's name, Jober is, mention it. And they used 2 case studies to put forward this idea of, amputating your limb. It's a paraphilia. And frankly, self-demand kind of consumer-driven healthcare in 1977. It's extraordinary. So maybe could you tell us your whole kind of experience, Malcolm, so that we kind of know what were you like at the beginning when you first heard about it? Because I've heard it before and it's such a good story and I'd love to hear it again. The whole lot, like from the beginning, you got a call.
Right. I'll do a potted version.
It really gives everybody the vibe of what's going on in this world.
The first thing I'll say, though, is the revealing thing about Money's paper, I think he may even refer to it, is that he was switched on to it, if you like, because he read letters in Penthouse magazine. I mean, he was a consumer of porn, Mr. Money. And so it's interesting that it started there and then he took it and then tried to turn it into something scientific. But No, I was phoned out of the blue by the producer of a show. I'd made a number of BBC Horizons. They're the flagship BBC science show, hour-long, single subject. And she was my mentor, and she said, look, I really need you to do me a favor. There's a guy that I need you to go and film in Germany. I need it done by the end of the week. There's just one thing. He wants to have his leg chopped off, and we're going to film him and then follow him when he goes to Scotland. I was living in London at the time, but she knew I was Scottish, and so you'd go up to Edinburgh and film him there too. So I was like amazed. I mean, who on earth wants to get their legs chopped off? But Horizon covers did cover lots of extreme medical stuff. So I went. The thing that was weird was that the producer of the actual film himself was also called Malcolm. And so the two Malcolms were going to Germany. But Malcolm, the other Malcolm, Neil, who's very talented, is himself an amputee. He lost his leg when he was a kid, like 15 or something, in an accident. And he had stumbled across this fetish group who both, those two words that you started with, Mia, who were both into amputees and turned on by the idea of being one. And he was shocked by this, and he got involved. But because he was an amputee himself, he was able to get under the surface, if you like. Maybe he waved his stump around, I'm not sure, but he was able to get them to open the doors in a way that an ordinary journalist wouldn't. And so we went together to see Hans and Dusseldorf, and we were there together for two days filming. But also, as with all of these interviews, it's when you put the camera down and then you get to know and you have a drink and everything. I suppose a bit like psychotherapy. When it's off the clock, you actually get a lot of cues that you might not get when the clock is on. But when I was talking to him, I mean, I had been told by Malcolm from the notes that the psychiatrists had all said, there's nothing you can do. This is just mysterious. It's a strange condition. The guy wants to do it. And then he told me his life story. And I was like, what the hell? I don't know if I actually told you the last time his life story. I meant to tell you. Well, the point is, he had always had this obsession since he was an adolescent that he wanted his leg chopped off. But his mum and dad ran a prosthetics factory. And just after, hello, are there any clues here?
You don't need to be Freud.
No, exactly. It's not exactly. You don't bother with the couch. You don't need to lie down. So this guy was telling me over a drink that his mum and dad, because it was 20 years ago, and I think he was like 6 years old. So it was just after World War II. Thousands of German soldiers needing arms and legs. His mum and dad the factory produced these legs and arms, and he said to me, and I looked at them when they were fitting the legs to these soldiers, and they were so, giving them so much attention, and I just thought I didn't get that attention. And he told me this, and I was thinking, well, there must be something we can do with psychiatry for this. You don't have to actually, I mean, your mum and dad are not going to love you now if you get your leg chopped off. So, it was so
Can
bizarre.
I interrupt?
Yeah, sure.
Because that's really interesting, because when I was reading for the case study for the WPATH files, I read as much of the old literature as I could on apotemnophilia, and that was the recurring theme. I think I even bring it up in the WPATH files, that the obsession with being an amputee very often began in childhood. And there's one story that's exactly like the one you just told. It's a woman, and she's been obsessed with being an amputee for most of her life. And it's because she remembers this. Her parents were very cold and distant and not loving at all. And she remembers one day a child on crutches who was an amputee going by her house, and her mother showing such great sympathy for this poor disabled child. And from that point on, she became obsessed with being wanting to be an amputee herself, but then when she became an adolescent, it became a sort of all-consuming obsession. But then I think I put it in the report that another striking parallel is if you watch that absolutely insane eunuch session at the WPATH 2022 conference, they're profiling eunuch identified men, and a massively disproportionate number of them grew up on farms and had witnessed animals being castrated. So there's something something in childhood going on here.
Would have witnessed presumably their fathers or somebody very close to them amputating, you know what I mean, giving care and attention, engagement to the animal, and that's what they're seeing.
Like normalizing it. And
and also that's where mommy's and daddy's attention is. So that's where all the engagement is. But keep on going, Malcolm.
Sorry,
Go
Malcolm,
on,
go.
tell us about
Yeah, so that's the bit that we didn't get around to the last time, and I was sure I had forgotten to tell you. And so it immediately made me think, well, A, I was sympathetic, and B, I just thought, well, why is it that these psychiatrists and this strange surgeon is willing to do this? Now, as it turned out, I mean, I'll tell you the rest of the story, but the thing that's important to learn is that, or to know, is that Robert Smith, the surgeon, was obsessed with, in the film, he was presented as this guy who was just trying to help. But actually, for years after, he was writing articles, he was banging the drum, he tried to get private hospitals to do the operations instead. There is no evidence, and he may still be alive, so I've got to be careful what I say, but there's no evidence that he himself was apotemnophiliac or acro, whatever it is. But there was definitely something, he was deeply invested in the whole field, as was Greg Firth, who was the collaborator with money, who wrote the original letters to the porn magazine Penthouse, and then wanted to get his leg chopped off by Robert Smith. I mean, obviously...
And he was the third one, and you were filming when he got rejected, am I right?
Well, I was only ever filming with Hans, so
Okay.
I didn't do any other filming.
But is his rejection is in the documentary, I think.
Indeed, yes, he's really upset. Now, I suspect that, and this is where I would be critical of Horizon on reflection now that I know a lot more, because I suspect that the reason he didn't get the operation is because by then he was well known as a sexual fetishist. That did not come out in the film, not just because he wrote the article in Penthouse, but the year before, 2 years before the show, he was involved in a legal case in America when, you know exactly what I'm going to say, Mia, but where his friend Philip Bundy, I think his name was.
Yeah.
Firth, that's his name. He drove, I think, halfway across America with his 72-year-old friend who was a little bit too frail to fly. So he drove them for thousands of miles to California, to New Mexico, I think, where he was then operated on. He'd always wanted his leg removed. And Firth had found a surgeon to do it, but the surgeon to do it was a guy who had already been in trouble with the law for doing amateur transsexual amputations. I mean, a couple of people, I think, died under, well, a couple of transsexuals got really badly damaged. I think a couple may have died, but this guy, Philip Bundy, then died. And the thing that was revealing was that in the case, it came out that Firth was a sexual fetishist, that he'd organized the surgery, and that he'd initially lied to the police when they found his, when the guy died. Firth lied to the cops and said, oh, no, it was a car accident. And then eventually they offered him a plea deal where he got immunity if he gave testimony against the surgeon, who was known as Tabletop Brown because he did operations on a kitchen tabletop. I mean, it was just awful.
And there's further parallels because they, when the online world opened, they found each other. These people who came from all four corners of the world. And there's a story of this guy, Cal, who discovered, that he was obsessed sexually with amputees. And then he went to Washington State Library specifically to look up pictures of amputations and found that the pictures had been torn out of the book. And with that, he realized, first of all, he was very distressed that there was no pictures, but secondly, realized, oh, there's more than me.
Yes.
Roll on 40 years, and he was running a support group as such
Yeah.
for other, wannabes, devotees, pretenders.
Yeah.
And they had a secret network, which is very familiar, of finding surgeons all over the world who would perform these operations. It's incredibly similar.
Well, I mean, racing forward, the recent 20-year sentence to a LGBT activist in London who ran a group, he was called the Eunuch Maker, and that group of devotees of castration, who they had 2,000 people who paid him to watch the castrations, and this castration group were discovered by the cops. They arrested this Norwegian LGBT activist who'd moved to London, and he's now been sentenced to 20 years in jail. But not only did he castrate guys, he chopped a leg off. I mean, it's sort of like, in the whole that whole bizarre torture world, the two things are not really so separate.
Could you speak a little bit about Robert Smith, I think it was, who was performing the surgical operations in Scotland, and then afterwards, Carrie, you might talk about what must have been the Scottish, because they performed 2 amputations and then they stopped on the third, Malcolm. So if you give a little bit of about that, and Carrie, because you're working in a hospital, what must it have been like when they did it? I just can't imagine. It was about 25 years ago. Is that right, Malcolm?
It was 2000, yeah, so 24 years ago, yeah. I mean, the thing, they were so stupid to do this, and the surgeon was so stupid to do this because they did it on the NHS. So each operation was costing the taxpayer £3,000. Had they gone straight to a private hospital and done it, it would have been less scandalous, because or the public would have been less motivated. The Daily Mail couldn't have made a big fuss about your local hospital in Falkirk is doing this chopping. And one of the guys was German. The third guy was going to be, American. So why would you spend British taxpayers' money removing German people's legs? I mean, it's absurd.
In Scotland.
Yeah, in Scotland. And the thing that came out, I can't remember his name, Kevin Wright, I think. When all this came out, it turned out that an operation had been done 3 years before, the first one by Robert Smith, by Kevin Wright. And Kevin Wright was interviewed, and he told the story of how, and interestingly, he was a straight guy with kids. And we've talked about this before, Stella, about how he struck everyone as incredibly rational, incredibly sensible. And he said it was the best thing I've done, and I needed it done, and I'm really happy now, and blah, 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 blah.
And you see, that's a very important point around the mental health. You can meet people who have quite severe mental illness, and they are perfectly rational in 95% of their life. And then there's 5% that is crazy and wants their legs amputated. Or like there's another woman, it's not just men, because there's a woman who assigned with her therapist to blind herself. And so she put, kind of numbing kind of eye drops and then drain cleaner on her eyes. And she said she never felt happier because she knew she was blinding herself. And it actually didn't happen immediately. It took 6 months before she was fully blinded. And she was fully happy with the results. So I can see a question that's come in already saying, what's the regret rate? And I'm not sure whether that concept really passes muster with, and you can answer to this, Carrie, whether the patient is happy and whether the patient doesn't regret it. I don't know. We're going into very extreme ethics. If somebody's put drain cleaner in their eyes to blind themselves, and her family disowned her afterwards because they found out that she did it to herself and that she did it because she wanted to be blind. That's what the desire was.
I mean, imagine your
do
family.
you care whether she regrets it or not? Because I'm like, Is this appropriate in a hospital? Should this be happening anywhere near a hospital, clinic, or anything like it?
Yeah.
Because this has nothing to do with healthcare, arguably.
Right. Well, this thread reminds me a little bit more of like Munchausen's in the sense of really inducing like an illness that then is they're hoping to gain sympathy, right? Because if you're cutting off a leg, one leg, let alone two legs, you know, you're going to have ambulatory issues, and visibly it's more inducing, well, you have a disability, you know, and you need sympathy and special, you know, sort of
Which
special
does seem to be
care.
mixed up with it all.
Yeah, and when you're blinding yourself, you're then again inducing, you know, sympathy. And it sounds like the story of, you know, the young man whose parents were making, you know, artificial limbs for the post, you know, for war veterans is in that realm. And we do know, right, with some of this the online contagion and the sort of in the social milieu at school, and the messages are always that trans people are under assault and there's a trans genocide and there's, you know, everywhere. And so you always have to say yes in order to make them, you know, feel better. And so I do feel like, you know, the amputation aspect is a little bit in that Munchausen vein. But yeah, to think that in a hospital, you know, so things are flying under the radar where someone's amputating a healthy limb, you know, in this very rational manner, obviously is very shocking. I guess, you know, what's shocking is they were upset because, you know, the healthy limbs were from like a different, you know, country out, like it wasn't an English leg, it was a Scottish leg or whatnot. So I don't, in the States, we don't, you know, I guess someone in New York might be upset if it was like a limb or something from Texas.
Well, in fairness, no, Carrie, it was a German guy, if I'm
Oh,
right.
okay.
A German guy who was using the English health system to have a leg removed. Is that right, Malcolm?
Yeah, the British Health Service, yeah. It was taxpayers' money being used for foreigners who were coming in and getting it done. And even if it had been British people who were getting it done, if they'd paid for it themselves, then the moral, it would have been a completely different debate in a strange way.
Interesting. Yeah.
And could you tell us a little bit about the debate? What happened, Malcolm? Was it huge or was it?
It was pretty, it was instant. I mean, front page news, shocking, BBC coverage, broadcasters, newspapers, the NHS trust that ran the hospital had to issue, because they given ethical consent for the operations to happen. So they were on the back foot, and they apologized. They said that they would never have it again, never allow it again. So did the NHS say that it was never going to happen again. And then Robert Smith tried that year to try and get private hospitals to agree to do it. But I think they would probably have agreed to do it if he'd come to them first. But after the headlines and all the agitation, they didn't touch it with a barge pole. Now, I wouldn't be surprised to discover that some hospitals have done it since.
Well, yes, because that's exactly where I was going to go. And I'm interested in all of your opinions on this. Then out they came with the concept of body integrity identity disorder. And they said, hang on a second, some people might have apotemnophilia, which is a paraphilia, and it's a sexual urge, and no surgeon should ever amputate a limb because of this sexual fetish. However, other people, this might sound familiar, have an identity issue, and they actually feel better if they have their limbs removed. It might be the finger, it might be their hand, it might be their leg. And actually, this is valid. This has a reason for doctors to diagnose and to intervene. And they then went further, and I don't say this with any, I genuinely, I don't know neuroscience, I'm no neuroscientist, but they did identify a part of the parietal lobe that if you had that piece missing, that you could technically have an issue with. And it does feel so mad that you're almost lucky you're not having any of it, Malcolm. It does feel so mad. Wait, everybody, slow down, everybody. It does feel like, you know, when you look at brains for different things, that it's something about it rang true to me that it could be some sort of mismatch in your brain. That doesn't mean, before I get rained on by everybody, that doesn't mean one should amputate. It could give an understanding for the brain mechanism, if you follow me. I'd never kind of done the two leaps, as in the first leap is it could be originating in the brain. That's fine. I don't really care. That still doesn't mean it should happen. You know what I mean? There's two steps to this thought. And the first step is, yes, it could be, because our brains are very complex, and the people who have this are willing to cut off their own legs. The one guy put his leg into dry ice. He measured the temperature perfectly so that in a few days, his leg, after a long time in dry ice, would rot off. It would turn black and it would rot off. Then he did his second leg. And he did the very same. Dry ice rotted that leg off. And then he's actually one of the very few that have come forward to say he regretted it. And what happened was, after he'd done his two legs with dry ice, removed them, he, this familiar yet again, familiar is the kind of name of this episode, his amputation fantasy continued, and he wanted to amputate other limbs. And so that's when he decided to have therapy, because he'd been obsessed with his limbs all along.
If only he'd started with fingers. He started with smaller things. He could have
fingernails.
Yeah.
but no, he
Haircuts.
started with his two legs. And he got intensive psychotherapy and realized that he didn't need to amputate, and regretted the whole thing and came out as a regretter. Before the question that somebody said, do they regret it? Not huge numbers of regret. And I think sometimes we place too much store on, you know, the mind can really bring ourselves to, you know, the mind has mountains. Where the mind brings you to, any of us who's lived any sort of life know how mad your brain can go. And so I don't know that should be where clinicians should be well, they're happy with it. And I'm like, yeah, lots of people are happy with pretty crazy stuff. That doesn't mean supervised, well-salaried, responsible clinicians should carry this out.
And now
carry on, Mal.
we're at this tiny group right now. And the point that, you know, I keep going back to that Mia made is, once something becomes normalized, it draws in people, not the people, that tiny group that are absolutely driven, or whose mum and dads ran a prosthetics factory, you know, sort of slightly niche, but or you know, the woman that saw you know, a cripple outside and her mum looked. It draws in lots of people who can then attach this as a solution to autism and their other problems, because that's of course what's happened with kids. With transgenderism, it's become the go-to answer for a whole bunch of, you know, things that make you unhappy. And this, you know, it's what Mia said, you know, sort of loads of kids could easily be convinced that there's a condition that makes people happier. They remove a leg and it gives them something to live for, etc., etc., etc.
Yeah, it's like, have you read Crazy Like Us by Ethan Watters, when he talks about, oh, it's brilliant. He talks about the epidemic of anorexia in Hong Kong in the 1990s. And so there was a schoolgirl collapsed and died on the street, busy Hong Kong street, and it turned out she'd starved herself to death. And the media frenzy around it, they interview a whole bunch of Western psychiatrists, and they're talking about anorexia in a very Western sense. And they trigger an epidemic of anorexia in Hong Kong in the 1990s. They'd never seen such a phenomenon before, but they did have something that resembled, they did have their own version of anorexia. As is always the case, there's a particular, there can be a very rare tiny number of people expressing their madness in crazy ways in any culture. But he calls the epidemic of anorexia, first of all, it's the Western style, but he also calls it the Me Too anorexics. They're the ones who they're the widest circle. So you've got the core group who would have suffered from anorexia, whether or not there was any social influence, whether or not there was any media frenzy. And one of the interesting things about the anorexia one is they did educational programs in high schools to try to prevent such a tragedy from occurring again. And what they actually ended up doing was increasing the numbers quite dramatically. It was like, you know, the best intentions. Yeah. But the same thing, that was the whole point of my apotemnophilia thread, obviously, was you know, there've always probably been people who desired to be amputees for whatever reason. It's probably, I'm not convinced by the brain thing, Stella. I'm still almost completely 100% convinced of the paraphilic desire. But then you normalize it, and the messaging that kids receive when they're in a crucial stage of identity development it matters. It really matters. And so if you are, like, we teach children that you can be born with a mismatched gender identity. You can be born in the wrong body. You can change sex. It's totally normal. If you feel like a girl in a boy's body, then you just get drugs and surgeries and you'll be happy. The messaging that kids receive while they're still forming their identity is really, really important. So I am absolutely convinced that if we did bombard kids with the same messaging, that it's, you know, people can be born with innate amputee identities. If we put amputees into children's television shows, if surgeons advertise their amputee services, like, you know, the TikTok ghoul, you know, we could trigger a social contagion of children and adolescents identifying as amputees. But on the regret thing, just to go back, I think the regret, again, I'm always talking about this, how self-report is absolutely not in any way an appropriate way to measure regret, because if you have chosen to have your leg cut off, and then after the fact, you are going to be so psychologically motivated for that to have been the right decision, because you made that decision for yourself. You're hardly going to, you know, look at your life and think, oh yeah, that was a big mistake. That's a really big thing to admit to yourself. But I wouldn't be surprised if the regret rate is lower than sex reassignment or all of these drugs and surgeries, certainly the genital surgeries, because if you identify as an amputee and you're obsessed with the idea of becoming an amputee, and then you have your leg chopped off, you actually become an amputee. Yes. You are now an amputee. You have fulfilled that desire. Whereas the man who is absolutely obsessed with the idea of becoming a woman, to the point that he will have his penis inverted and turned into an open wound that he must dilate for the rest of his life, he still hasn't become a woman at the end of it. And he probably was very convinced that the surgery was going to solve everything and turn him into a woman, and everything would be amazing and his life would be wonderful. And then he gets to the other end and he's got to dilate forever, and things aren't quite how he imagined them. And he knows he's not a woman, no matter how much he strenuously insists that he is a woman, he knows deep down that he's not a woman, and he knows that everyone around him also know that he's not a woman. So I would think that the regret rate just would be higher for sex reassignment surgery for that reason.
I think that's a really good point, and I hadn't thought of that. I would say, however, that before I go on, but I think we shouldn't assume that any part of gender affirming surgery or healthcare isn't paraphilic. I think it's all paraphilic in exactly the same way you think that everything to do with amputees is paraphilic. And I think it's important, because what transgenderism has managed to do is what you can see the amputation lot trying unsuccessfully to do. It's cleansed itself, or has attempted to cleanse itself. And for a lot of the public, it has cleansed itself of the association with paraphilia by turning itself into a social justice movement, to a deep, you know, identity, a lifelong this, a lifelong that. And so it's moved away from Penthouse magazine and weird sort of sissy culture and all from where it came. And the AGP, the dreaded AGP stuff that was all rooted in. And it's now sort of like arisen anew, you know, like Aphrodite is sort of like reborn as a virgin. But I think it's all paraphilic, almost all of it.
Okay,
Wait.
but I can I just
Go ahead.
okay.
Yeah.
So I see I just talked about the Ethan Watters and his Me Too anorexics. To me, your ROGD girls are your Me Too anorexics. They just got sucked in and they're identifying with a certain aspect of the disorder, but they don't have this. I can't believe that the ROGD girls are in any way paraphilic. I can't. I think they're the Me Too gender dysphorics, that they've got a totally different type.
I think
Yeah.
if you talk, I mean, obviously you've talked to lots of detransitioners, and I've talked to a lot too. And some, may not all, will admit that. I mean, obviously it gets all sort of mixed up when they start taking testosterone. They do have these really strong sexual desires and their sexuality changes and all the rest of it. I'm sure it's with the ROGD girls, I'm sure it may start in a different way. And it's not, as I say, like AGP focused, warp, obsessive paraphilia, but it can't be an accident that they want to change the genitals, and it can't be an accident that so many of them get sort of, I mean, so many of these girls are now gay boys and they're in gay relationships with other gay boys. They're not the two girls. Now, it's mixed in a lot with, you know, loathing and fear of being a lesbian and all of those things, of course. But I think if you go on to some of the sites and you hear about, you know, the measuring up of the phalloplasty and the different ways to pump it and all, it sounds very redolent of male paraphilia obsessing about the depth of the vagina that they're going to get.
Do
I
you
mean-
not think? So go.
I was just gonna say, I do think though the level in schools and infiltration in schools is really related to, I think, you know, the trans student as the champion, as the underdog, as the person getting the attention. I do think, at least in the States, that is a big factor where they're the favored group, and then other, you know, gets into the oppressed narrative
That's where I'm saying about this cleansing of the reputation and representing as sort of transitioning into a social justice movement, the brave, the champion, the better, the queers, all this stuff. Absolutely, it's all mixed in there. But, you know, in the same way that a lot of paraphilics are smuggled into the movement of, you know, the social justice, you know, label, I think a lot of paraphilia is in there too. And I would see that the next thing that the amputees will do is, of course, try to represent themselves as some sort of liberation movement, body, you know, not body integrity, body autonomy, you know, it's sort of, we speak for everyone, we are the front line of body autonomy, etc., etc., etc. And somehow give themselves a cover story for essentially being a movement of paraphilia.
But a lot of those kids, let's say the original amputee cohort, you know what I mean? The original, before there was any sort of talk of any sort of social contagion, just like the original who sought to be the opposite sex, you know, quite a lot of them, it seemed to start in childhood and they got some sort of thrill, which is almost like pre-sexual. And then the sex hormones came in and then they got a sexual charge, if you follow me. And that's where I think it might get very interesting to study, because you could argue maybe there was some sort of thrill, and then for some people the sex hormones might come in and they didn't get a thrill, and that's how they got liberated from it. But, you know, having had my own experiences with gender as a kid, it just wasn't centered around genitals. It just wasn't. I was there, if you follow me. And you know what I mean? If it was, I'd be the first to say it because I want to figure it out.
Yeah.
But it just wasn't. It was all, for me, it was all to do with roles. And that's why I think gender dysphoria, actually, gender identity disorders is almost my favorite description, insofar as it
Mine
was
too.
about, yeah, it was, I wanted to be with that club, not that. I want to be in that tribe, not that tribe. And
Yeah.
then other people, definitely, it became much more fixated about their genitals. And that's arguably, I'm not really so into the different diagnoses and stuff like that. But when it becomes, when at the right time or at the wrong time, your hormones come in, you get a thrill, it all gets mixed up. I can see how off you go into a paraphilia if you're of a certain mindset and there's a certain background, and who knows what that is. But there's a lot of combos, is what I'm trying to say.
I think my suspicion is maybe not as many girls as boys, but a lot of troubled boys and girls need a sort of metaphor for sex and the trouble that they have with it. And if they can find a social justice cause, LGBTQ, then it's a sort of safe space, I hate to use that term, where they can sort of explore that. It reminds me, I was trying to find it earlier on, that's why I kept tippy tapping on the keyboard. There was this amazing, and you probably know it, around about 1720s in France and Paris, there was this explosion of mainly women, girls and women, who were called the convulsionaires. And they would meet in a churchyard, Saint Médard, and they would go nuts and they would convulse and froth. And then they took to beating each other. And then they would dance naked. And this is like, I mean, crowds of Parisians would come to watch, funnily enough. Why would they?
I can't imagine why.
What are you doing at 2 o'clock while the convulsionaires are up the road? Why not?
Go to see the naked women, then.
But it became like, because it was politically charged. And that's the thing, rather than it just being girls going crazy in a churchyard, they were sort of associated with a particular priest who was a rebel priest, and he was an upstanding person and a bit of a rebel. And so that it was sort of like the two things came together. You had like a social justice and sort of upstanding moral cause. And then you had the convulsionaires in the middle of it, and the two things, and that's the reason for a long time the church and the Ancien regime found it difficult to clamp down on it. And then eventually the riots became so much they had to close it down. And I've always thought there's something, and David Hume went to the site. It was long after this happened, but when he visited Paris, he went to the site because he was trying to understand the power of religion. And I think there's something in a lot of these mad, sort of masochistic sects and cults that if they can put a veneer of social justice on top of them, then it becomes A, harder to detect, and B, gives latitude to the people within it because they don't feel guilty. Oh, I'm not a sexual fetishist. I'm just convulsing for God.
Wow.
Oh.
Yeah. What I was going to say was that there's been an awful lot of kind of extraordinary in Europe, you know, the people who thought they were made of glass, there was that social contagion. There was the dancing contagion where people were dancing until the death. But what I find really kind of amazing about this social contagion, the gender as well as the amputee, is it coincides very, very perfectly with our kind of almost devoted, divine kind of respect for the oppressed identity, the victim, you know, the kind of the holiness of the victim. And so I can really see, you know, there's an awful lot of people who are you know, going to an awful lot of marches, trans activists and stuff like that. And so often they have canes, so often they're in wheelchairs. It feels like they're meeting each other. And I have to say, osteoporosis is huge among people who medically transition. But I can't help think that they will leap to having a cane, being in a wheelchair, and they will inevitably meet body integrity identity disorder along with gender dysphoria. These are two kind of a match made in heaven. I do think Carrie's point about Munchausen's is an underdeveloped point. I think, you know, the paraphilias is one point, but I actually psychologically get more excited by the Munchausens. Maybe that's different between a man and a woman. I just think it really resonates as what's going down with these kids. A kind of give me sympathy, a bottomless well of you will give me kind of sympathy for these terrible, terrible, torturous ailments that I'm experiencing.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Go ahead, Mia. No, I'll go after you.
in a similar vein, I suppose, with the apotemnophilia, in a lot of the literature, there was this. So part of the fantasy was, part of the erotic nature was they were turned on by the actual stump. But then on the other hand, there were fantasies about overachieving in the face of adversity. So like their sexual fantasies, some of them would often center around, you know, climbing a mountain as an amputee. That was a really erotic motivation. And that's, I guess, similar to not quite the same as Munchausen's, but that's kind of similar. So I wonder if there's a, you know, being trans and achieving and thriving in life. I wonder if that is maybe part of the drive.
Well, the society is their mountain, isn't it? A transphobic society. They're trying to make their way in this most bigoted society. And as you say, it's sort of recasting themselves as the sort of hero of their own narrative, isn't it?
Right.
Yeah. And I do see, you know, in the hospital, and this really did explode with the opioid epidemic, obviously, but just the general culture, the milieu of, you know, that there's a pill for every, you know, mood problem now, is that there's become a subculture, at least in the States, of well-bodied people who are disabled, like very invested in their disabilities as an identity. And and, you know, I'm not talking about, you know, people who are very obviously really disabled that cannot function, but that was what the disability class was for a very long time, but it kind of exploded in our country with like redefinitions and you know, coming from a place of, you know, again, always trying to be helpful. But that's part of the story of the opioid epidemic, because they classified a lot of chronic pain and back pain as a disability. And I think that provided the milieu for people then, you know, if they were started on pills that were needed, but then it sort of spiraled and the lines got blurred where it's becoming an addiction. And then your lifestyle is that you're a chronic pain patient who's addicted. And, you know, we would see that in the hospital. And I do fear, you know, that element with you know, the trans-identified patients, the sort of disability aspect, you know, getting ingrained as well, like as Stella's mentioning, with, you know, real physical ailments popping up, osteoporosis. Are they then now going to become addicted to pain pills and then become, you know, a disability class, which, you know, is not healthy, mentally healthy to have your identity be a sick person.
But to be a sick person, anybody who's studied, you know, hypochondria or anything around that, to be a sick person, you get a very special status in life. You get a lot of attention. Whenever things go wrong, if you wish, you could pull, I'm sick. You can avoid an awful lot of conflict. You can avoid an awful lot of responsibility. You get a lot back psychologically. You can avoid everything difficult. And every time somebody says you're behaving badly, you've got a shield. You know what I mean? And life is incredibly difficult. Sorry, don't know.
Yeah, no, and that was part of what was so challenging at the peak of, you know, the opioid explosion, when the medical bureaucracy was still on the, you know, prescribe because we want good, you know, patient experience scores, before the whole culture, you know, somewhat changed for various reasons I've talked about. But it was very hard to be the doctor saying, well, you know, I understand you've got this, you know, pain issue. However, you know, you're making it worse by, you know, being, you know, completely, you know, comatose on pills. Like it, you know, your ailments are getting worse because you can't move and you can't function. But they were so, you know, invested in it that, obviously that wasn't, a popular message. So I think that that's part of why this is very hard for people in doctors' offices when they're sitting across, a very unhappy child and parents who are scared to death and, just want the best for their kids. And there's this whole culture around saying, this is a sick child, and if you don't do these things, it's going to get worse. You can see the tremendous pressure that the societal milieu has invested in this identity.
Yeah, I was reading, I remember reading, I think it was Robert Smith, the surgeon. He had the weird inversion of the Hippocratic Oath in that he was saying, it's, first do no harm, but the harm is actually withholding the surgery from these patients. And that's I've read that so many times with these gender doctors now. I was just reading it the other day because I was a speaker at a New Zealand event, and I looked into their PATHA, their WPATH, and on their website was, talk about it's an ethical requirement not to do harm. And I thought, oh, maybe these guys are, somewhat sane. But no, I read on, and the harm is withholding puberty blockers. The harm is withholding the genital surgery. And again, it's that weird inversion of the Hippocratic Oath where doing harm is not doing harm in their world. It's weird.
Isn't it? Yeah, it's totally 1984, isn't it? Doing harm is not to do harm. I mean, what?
Exactly, it is. It's Orwellian, and again, that was the message during it's part of what fueled the opioid epidemic. All the messages and the incentive structures were around the fact that you were not upholding your Hippocratic Oath because you were withholding, these pain medicines that weren't addictive, that weren't, everything was great, and you're a bad doctor for making someone suffer. So that's, the inversion has happened before, and it's happening again.
And to go back onto that body integrity identity disorder, the way people spoke is like, I feel better. I feel more at one with myself now. I've removed my limb. I feel more myself. It's all the same kind of identity language.
The wrong body narrative, huge in all of the literature. Like I feel that I should be in the body of an amputee. My body is not my own. And when if I get my leg cut off, then I will be my true self. It's the true self brought about by surgical amputation, but it's exactly the same wrong body stuff.
I see John Bingham, and if anybody wants to put it in Q&A, now's the time to put in some questions. I like this question, and it's to you, Carrie. I would say that the absence of regret is in no way proof of success, but the presence of regret is a clear indicator of failure that ought to alarm even the people performing the procedure. Carrie has a lot to say about the hazards of viewing medicine as a customer satisfaction business. The customer's always right. And that's where we've moved from being patient-led to customer-led. So is it a patient or is it a customer? Is this healthcare or is this a shop? Because that's what's going on here. What do you think, Carrie? Because I'm sure you've really saw that with the opioids.
Yeah, and I've talked about that, and John and I have talked about that before, and it's related to what I was saying with the opioid epidemic and what I had talked about before in the States, what I call the MBA, Masters of Business Administration, MBAization of healthcare. A lot of doctors, got their MBAs in addition to healthcare, or just folks with MBAs went in and it's become so bureaucratic. And part of that was this, taking a lot of the metrics from business school, like patient satisfaction scores, net promoter score, which is likely to recommend on the scale of 1 to 10. If a net promoter of your business is 7 or above, because they're going to go tell their friends, wow, that was great. So a lot of this stuff seeped into the way hospitals function and medical groups function. We have consolidation, et cetera. So, when we talk about guidelines and standards and all kinds of things, they clash sometimes with what the hospital bureaucracy and business is asking for. And again, the opioid epidemic was prime there because, you know, as Mia was saying with the amputees, you know, folks getting their pain pills, there was no regret. You know, their life may be messy. They might not have been able to go to work, but boy, their pain was better, but their tolerance and their addiction was going up. The only time they regretted is, you know, after a really bad overdose that they barely didn't survive, but some of them were just, you know, it's an addiction. They were back out there. So I think that's where this, you know, customer service, the medicine as a business, and the problem you're solving is the patient satisfaction and happiness, which we know is more, depending on what you're dealing with, is not necessarily related to the medical problem that you're solving. They're two different things, but unfortunately, there's a lot of incentive put in place, and that's really scaled up a lot of these things that are really harming patients and causing a bigger mess.
And even if the patient is happy with it and never regrets it, because some, you know, that wasn't it the first, you'll know this, Mia, the first person who had successful as such medical transition then died and you'll know this too, Malcolm, then died a couple of months later saying, I'm happy that it happened. I'm not sure, like I say, that needs to be any concern of the clinicians.
I mean, the bottom line is, if we are not going to, if we are sort of bullied into saying they're not mentally ill, then of course it becomes a real issue whether or not they're happy or not happy. If we just start from the basics that they're fucking nuts, then the fact that they're happy afterwards, you think, well, sure, I don't care, you're nuts. You were nuts before you had your knob chopped off, and now you're happy you had your knob chopped off, but it's irrelevant to society because you're mentally ill. And so, I mean, that's why I think with all of these, you know, conditions, the first thing they try to do is insist that, oh, no, it's not a medical diagnosis, it's not pathological, you know, it has to be taken off the list of pathologies, because then you can't say, in perhaps more polite language, that they're troubled and that they're ill. But if they're mentally ill, does it matter whether or not they regret?
Yeah.
Well, right. And just the other thing I would say, Stella, just really quickly, is that really that again highlights where we've gotten with consumer healthcare, because again, you know, a lot of this going on, to your point, Malcolm, is about bullying. And who ultimately are they bullying? They're bullying the people who are writing the prescriptions and doing the surgeries, right? And that is collided with this terrible, you know, buildup in healthcare of the doctor, the prescriber wanting to be liked because it's tied to their bonuses. If this wasn't related to needing prescription medicines or surgeries, we wouldn't be involved with, you know, the medical people at all. This is obviously, the mental illness requires a medical community to be involved. And it's just at a time where medicine, at least in the States, you know, has all these financial pressures, but the consumerization, it's a perfect storm where all these people don't want to, the pressure to say yes to the wrong things to a mentally ill person is so high. And that's just a sign of a sick system.
Yeah, since the arrival, though, of Google, I have to admit, I use my doctor as somebody who dispenses the medication that I want, if you follow me. There's no doubt about it. My attitude has absolutely changed, where I'm like, I know what's wrong with me and I know what I need, and stop the faffing around taking my blood pressure.
Okay.
Well, you know what I mean? I know, yes, I'm sorry, Carrie. It's like,
yes. Because like I practiced when we were on paper charts and there wasn't, you know, Dr. Google, and you do have to learn how to have a conversation, because people come in and I'll say, I can tell they're trying to tell me something. I said, well, what did Dr. Google say? They're like, oh, I'm embarrassed, I looked it up, but this is what they said, because I can't, until I know what's exactly on their mind, you know, I can't help them. But yes, it's a challenge, but still, being an ethical doctor, you say, you know, ultimately they're there because they want to see a real, you know, someone in the flesh. And you say, well, let me put it in context. This is actually, you know, that's what they're saying isn't actually right. You know, so it takes a lot of, yeah, backbone to not be
I mean,
Backbone.
that's a
Google.
similarity between the two movements, is they both want to get rid of medical gatekeeping. They
Yes.
want, as you say, to just tell the surgeon, chop my leg off,
Yeah.
to be driven by the patient.
And they've
And they must be
arguably
inspired by the trans movement.
they've buried apotemnophilia into body integrity identity disorder.
There you
They've buried
go.
autogynephilia into gender dysphoria.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
there's an interesting question here, which, you know, is very interesting. What is the relationship between transgender identities and autism? So we all have a lot to say about that. I have 2 kids with autism, not the fun kind, and it seems implausible that autistic people would be trans because they're not focused on what other people are thinking. Therefore, they're not focused, for example, on whether other people gender them properly. For a brief period, my daughter was obsessed with one earlobe being different from the other, and she wanted plastic surgery for it. Well, you know, hyperfixation is one element that certainly serves the kind of autistic temperament, as well as the person who seeks medical transition. Also, literal understanding of language. If you call me he, I am he. And black and white thinking, which is like, if I don't feel like a girl, well, then I must be a boy. And often when our bodies are changing and we're going through puberty, we don't quite feel like ourselves because we're changing so much. So they could feel a kind of a sense of alienation from their body and feel, oh, I'm not a girl, so I must be a boy. But not only that, you know, this question person is right, because you know, people who are autistic are often non-conforming. They're non-conforming in many different ways, and they might be gender non-conforming. And in this world, when you're gender non-conforming, it could be suggested of you, especially during your preteen and teen years, are you trans? You don't look like a girl, or you're not acting like a boy. Why are you wearing that? You know, you're not conforming. And so they question it, and they might be lonely. An awful lot of functioning autistic people turn to the trans identity. Thankfully, this parent didn't get her surgery for the earlobes. What do you all think about the autistic and the trans connection? I've no doubt, before we start, that body integrity identity disorder would have a disproportionate number of people with autism. It makes perfect sense.
I would just say, I mean, more asking you, Stella, like how much, it's hard to parse out how much is just that uncomfortable feeling you have going through adolescence. I think we all probably think, what if we went through adolescence and there was the internet, social media? I mean, I don't know, you know, how much of it is also that social media that allows people to like perseverate and like, you know, how they made it, you know, to be addictive and clicking and like slot machines in Vegas. So I don't know. I mean, I think it's confusing because we have this whole new technology. So I think it's confusing as to parse it all out. What sort of the discomfort we all feel normally with adolescence versus,
well,
you know.
We don't
yeah.
know. When you
Right.
say discomfort, what is mine to yours? Who knows?
Yeah.
For all I know, it's the very same, or it could be galactically different.
Yeah.
I've been reading the DSMs. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Oh, what joy.
Oh, yeah. What a
right.
joy.
Oh my gosh.
Lots of DSMs. I've been reading DSMs for weeks now.
Yeah.
And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's DSM-5, which was 2013. The diagnostic criteria changes to gender dysphoria. And then for adolescents, there's one of the criteria is it's something like desire to prevent the development of secondary sex characteristics, which is obviously because of the invention of puberty blockers. We now have the medical technology that enables us to block puberty. And so I don't know if you're familiar with Ian Hacking's looping effect of humankind, where like the diagnostic category shapes the patient and the patients shape the diagnostic category. And around that, there's culture and medicine evolving all at the same time. So you've got the medical technology, the medical ability to block puberty is influencing the patient cohort who are then approaching puberty, and they want to block their puberty because that's the worst thing is to develop in go through the so-called wrong puberty. But then I think when that got added to the diagnostic criteria, that was catastrophic, because think about, like, that suddenly is part of the diagnosis. Not wanting to go through puberty became part of the diagnosis of gender dysphoria. And I think, I could be wrong, but I think puberty is harder for the autistic adolescent. It's hard for everyone, so it puts all teenagers at greater risk of self-diagnosing with gender dysphoria. But I would think that it's probably even more difficult for the autistic adolescent going through puberty. So when they put that in the DSM, I think they naturally opened it up and made puberty even more risky for the autistic adolescent.
Well, the DSM has just become a disgrace, really. They've added and added and added until it's turned into this alphabet kind of
like a Rorschach, right? It could be whatever you want almost. I mean,
it's lost an
And
awful lot.
autism itself is surely, okay, it was a long time ago when I was a kid, but we didn't have autism in Ayrshire in, 50 years ago. And so, I mean, obviously we must have had it, but nobody got the diagnosis. And so there would be a much smaller, nobody was looking for it either. And that's the other thing. I mean, we now have, as you were saying, Mia, you've got this diagnostic infrastructure now where any child who just doesn't seem to, prosper or there's a whole bunch of people ready with about 15 different diagnoses. And, as with puberty, if you're allowed to go through puberty, gender dysphoria largely disappears, although, for 90% of them or whatever. You do wonder whether if you just let kids grow up, their autism would disappear too. But, we've got all these diagnoses now that we're labeling kids with who are just a little bit different. But and I wonder to what extent, it's society, but is it parents now? Are parents the problem, that they need these labels for their kids?
In fairness, I would say there's so much pressure on parents that I can see why parents would turn to labels as a way of, like, because it's hard to explain until you are, I don't think you are a parent, are you, Malcolm?
No,
but
I'm
like
not.
just how much
Thank
grief
God.
you get from the beginning, from the moment you're pregnant, like the
Yeah.
grief and pressure that's on parents to make sure your kids are well turned out, that they're achieving in all the things, that they're not too shy, but they're not too friendly. They're not too confident, but they're not too this. Oh my God. So yes, I can see why parents would say, no, it's not. It's just that they have this condition, because there's just so much pressure on kids. Parents, I really think it's way over the top, and I don't think it's fair on parents. So, and not only that, there's an awful lot of incentivizing in schools to get a diagnosis so that you can get extra resources in schools, So it's a built-in
That's an
system.
interesting factor.
Oh, it's huge. It's huge.
Malcolm, it's yeah. And Stella, the other thing, at least in the States, I don't know what in Ireland, that part of that is, I know for boys, there is the part of the explosion with ADD and putting them on medication was this, they changed schools, and in the States they got rid of, what they call physical education or free periods where they go out and play. And so some of it was like, with the decreased play time, boys obviously had a harder time sitting still, but then they received a label, and then medication. So it's complicated, but yes, this pressure that, oh, well, your kid's not sitting still, they must have ADD.
And when you've got, like, the vast majority of teachers are women, and there's a feminized teaching that's going from the nursery right up through, and that there isn't as many males, that's going to impact the boys in a big way. And sometimes, that's underestimated for a lot of these. We're coming up to the last few minutes. What should people take away from what happened with Apotemnophilia and body integrity identity disorder? For me, what people should take away is that there's extraordinary parallels. It leads with identity now. It used to be a paraphilia, but the paraphilia got submerged into an identity, and it hasn't taken off in the very same way as gender identity has taken off, arguably because the clinicians were very definitely they were reined in when they were about to take off in the late 90s. Malcolm saw it happen in real life. He saw it happening in real kind of time. They were reined in and they were given kind of, absolutely stop doing this. At the very same time, they didn't do that with gender identity. And that to me is the massive difference. Would each of you maybe make a last comment on that?
Well, I'm totally,
go
sorry,
ahead.
we've done that all night long. I'm totally with you, Stella, in that that's the message, is the messaging matters. It matters how it's reported in the media. That's what stopped the apotemnophilia. Like, the media did not report on it favorably. They didn't celebrate the amputee identities. They didn't celebrate the surgeons, and there wasn't a rights movement that turned it into a human right. And all of these things are actually possible. And I do genuinely fear that it is on the horizon. Like, we have the guy in Quebec, which I didn't even get to talk about, but we have one, right? He had his fingers amputated just last month or the month before. So I do fear that all of the necessary conditions for the nightmare world that I wrote about in my apotemnophilia thought experiment are there and just waiting to be ignited. So messaging matters. On the one hand, let's not trigger a social contagion, a psychiatric epidemic of apotemnophilia. And at the same time, let's change the messaging surrounding gender so that we can quell the flames, we can put out the flames of this one, and we can calm it all down, and it will go back to hopefully one day being a very rare condition. But yeah, how you talk about it, it really matters.
Yeah, and I'll just briefly build on that and just echo what I frequently say is that, historically there's been these scandals in healthcare, and there will be into the future, because healthcare is comprised of, fallible human beings, including physicians that, twist the Hippocratic Oath, think they're being helpful, etc. And we have this whole new element with the internet and social media and pressures on parents, as we said, showing up into the healthcare system. So you have to be, appropriately skeptical, and know that there has to be checks and balances. And right now we're in an environment where there aren't proper checks and balances, in an environment to, talk more openly, and have people more broadly raising their concerns. Malcolm, to you.
Yeah, I would say that the thing that we should learn from transgenderism to understand what's probably going on with the amputation lobby, if you like, is that for a long time, we didn't know what was going on behind the scenes in institutions. There were top level trans allies meeting in Jakarta and off the beaten track places. They were reframing the laws, making, sort of manifestos, and then sort of percolating through our institutions. I mean, I spoke to, I can't use her name because she has to be really quiet about trans stuff, but she's a top doctor in the whole sort of medical ethics area. And she says the pressure underneath her, the new generation coming up, is all influenced by queer theory and other sort of, weird ideas. And they are driving, as you were saying, about the patient-driven model of medical care, and the whole bodily autonomy is the big thing that they're talking about intellectually. And in the same way as 20 years ago, when they talked about self-expression of trans people, we didn't realize that they'd actually mean that they could go into rape crisis centers if they were men. I think there's a lot of that intellectual nonsense that is going to percolate through our institutions, and we'll turn around and actually, it'll be impossible to say that amputating your leg is nuts. They'll say, no, everyone's got the right to full bodily autonomy, and if they want to cut their limb off, you're the hateful person.
You've nailed it. Full body autonomy, it's become the new religion, along with consent. So long as people consent, everything can happen. Whether it's extraordinary sadism, so long as there's consent, who cares? Yes. It's a big thing, and I think we've made the great god of consent, and we're losing our way a lot with that. And we've kind of, as well as that, just what you just moved on, it was just kind of, we went from being patient-centered to being patient-led, to starting to reframe the patient as a customer who is always right. And, you know, if they're paying for it, go for it. And whether they regret it or not is central to whether we're going to do it or not. And I'm like, no. You don't do 7 years or 8 years training, Carrie. You don't go through all of that to be incredibly well salaried. I know it might be you, but you know, you're in this position of responsibility for a reason, because you would offer and dispense advice that perhaps other people wouldn't have the intellect or the commitment to do it. Anyway, delighted to see that there was 2,200 at the last look on Twitter. So hello, everybody. And we're going to be back next week. I think it's going to be on another day, and it'll be something very exciting because we're just in the middle of organising it. So thanks a million, Malcolm, for coming. I knew you'd be brilliant. And thank you, Mia and Carrie, as well, as always. Take care. Night now.